The universe should not exist. This is not a poetic exaggeration. This is a precise statement about what modern physics has concluded after a century of careful examination of the matter that fills the cosmos. According to the most rigorous accounting we have been able to make, the early universe should have produced equal amounts of matter and antimatter. Equal amounts of matter and antimatter, brought into proximity, mutually annihilate, leaving behind only radiation. The Big Bang, on the strict requirements of the symmetry that was assumed to govern the production of matter, should have produced an empty cosmos of pure light. There would be no galaxies, there would be no stars, there would be no planets, there would be no chemistry, there would be no life. There would certainly not be the configuration of matter that you currently are, reading these words at a particular moment in a particular place. And yet, here you are. The cosmos is full of matter, organized into galaxies and stars and planets and biological forms of staggering complexity. The matter exists. The fact of its existence is the most fundamental fact about the world we inhabit, and the question of why this matter exists, when, by the symmetry that was assumed to govern its production, it should have been entirely cancelled out by an equal amount of antimatter, is one of the deepest and most consequential puzzles in modern cosmology. The answer, as far as physics has been able to articulate it, involves a series of discoveries about the symmetry of nature itself. Through the middle of the 20th century, physicists assumed that the laws of physics were perfectly symmetric with respect to a small set of basic operations. The laws should not change if you reflected the universe in a mirror. The laws should not change if you replaced every particle with its antiparticle. The laws should not change if you reversed the direction of time. These three operations, known in physics as parity, charge conjugation, and time reversal, were treated as absolute symmetries that the universe must respect. The assumption seemed reasonable. The mathematical formulations of the major theories incorporated these symmetries automatically. The empirical evidence, as far as it had been accumulated by the early 1950s, supported the assumption. The universe, in the prevailing view, was a place that did not distinguish between left and right, between matter and antimatter, between forward and backward in time. The laws of physics were neutral with respect to all of these distinctions, and the apparent asymmetries we observe in everyday life were assumed to be features of how matter happened to be arranged rather than features of the underlying laws. This assumption turned out to be wrong. The universe, on closer examination, is not perfectly symmetric. The asymmetry that has been discovered is subtle, but it is profound, and it is precisely what allowed the universe to exist at all. The matter that fills the cosmos, the matter that constitutes you and the world around you, is the residue of a slight imbalance between matter and antimatter in the very early universe. If the symmetry had been perfect, the matter and antimatter would have annihilated entirely. The fact that they did not, the fact that there is something rather than nothing, is the result of a small but consequential breaking of the mirror symmetry that was assumed to govern the universe. The cosmos, in a precise sense, is the remainder after a vast cancellation. And the existence of this remainder, the matter that constitutes everything we know, is the consequence of a cosmic mirror that turns out, on examination, to be slightly imperfect. The story of how this asymmetry came to be recognized has its roots in the development of relativistic quantum mechanics in the late 1920s. Paul Dirac, working at Cambridge University, was attempting to formulate an equation that would describe the behavior of electrons in a way consistent with both quantum mechanics and special relativity. His equation, published in 1928, and now known as the Dirac equation, was successful in describing many features of electron behavior that earlier formulations had missed. But the equation had a strange feature. It admitted solutions corresponding to negative energy states, which seemed physically nonsensical Dirac, after considerable struggle with this feature, proposed in 1931 that the negative energy solutions corresponded to a new kind of particle, identical to the electron in mass, but with opposite electric charge. He called this hypothetical particle the anti-electron. The prediction was bold, and it was vindicated almost immediately. Carl Anderson, working at the California Institute of Technology, observed the predicted particle in cosmic ray experiments in 1932 and named it the positron. The discovery of antimatter as a real feature of the physical world, predicted theoretically and confirmed experimentally within a span of just a few years, was one of the most striking triumphs of theoretical physics in the early 20th century. The implications of antimatter for the symmetry of the universe were immediately clear. If every particle has a corresponding antiparticle, with identical properties except for opposite charge, then the laws of physics that govern these particles should treat the matter version and the antimatter version of any process identically. The universe, on this expectation, should not distinguish between matter and antimatter at the level of fundamental physics. And the natural consequence, when this expectation was applied to cosmology, was that the early universe should have produced equal amounts of matter and antimatter. The Big Bang, which converted enormous amounts of energy into particles, should have produced as many antiparticles as particles. The matter and antimatter, brought together in the dense conditions of the early universe, should have mutually annihilated, producing a cosmos of pure radiation with no surviving matter. The galaxies, the stars, the planets, the chemistry, the biology, all the structures that we observe in the present universe should not exist. The fact that they do exist is, on the simplest version of the symmetric expectation, deeply puzzling. The puzzle has been called the baryogenesis problem, the problem of explaining how the universe came to contain baryons, the heavy particles like protons and neutrons that constitute the matter we observe. In the apparent absence of an equal amount of antibaryons, the matter that exists is a small fraction of what was originally produced. For every billion antiquarks that existed in the very early universe, there was approximately 1,000,000,001 quarks. The vast majority of the original matter and antimatter mutually annihilated, leaving behind a vast bath of radiation and the small surplus of matter that constitutes everything we currently observe. The cosmos is, in a precise quantitative sense, this small surplus. The matter that we are made of, the matter that constitutes the observable universe, is what survived the annihilation. And the question of why there was a surplus at all, why the matter and antimatter were not produced in exactly equal amounts, is the central question that the discovery of asymmetry has been trying to answer. This is the situation we will be exploring in this series. The physics of mirror symmetry, the discoveries that established its breaking, and the implications for understanding why the universe exists at all are the subjects of the inquiry that follows. We will also examine, in subsequent parts of the series, what the world's deepest contemplative traditions have understood about mirrors and reflection, and what the convergence between the modern physical recognition and the older contemplative recognitions implies for the question of what we are and how we are situated in the cosmos. But the foundation of everything that follows is the physics, and the physics begins with a careful study of what mirrors actually do. The most familiar mirror in human experience is the ordinary planar mirror, the polished surface that reflects an image of whatever is placed before it. The basic physics of how this works has been understood since the early modern period. With the development of the wave theory of light by Christian Huygens in the 17th century, and its mathematical refinement by James Clerk Maxwell in the 19th. Light, as Maxwell established, is an electromagnetic wave that propagates through space at a finite speed. When a light wave encounters a smooth metallic surface, the electrons in the metal respond to the oscillating electromagnetic field by oscillating themselves and the moving electrons re-emit electromagnetic radiation that propagates back away from the surface. The angle of the re-emitted radiation, by the geometry of how the response works, equals the angle of the incoming radiation. The result is the familiar phenomenon of reflection, in which the light bouncing off the mirror produces an image of whatever sent the original light toward it. This basic picture, while accurate as far as it goes, conceals some surprising features when examined carefully. The most striking, and the one that has generated more philosophical confusion than any other ordinary phenomenon in physics, concerns what mirrors actually do to the spatial orientation of the images they produce. The standard explanation, that mirrors reverse left and right, is wrong. Mirrors do not reverse left and right. What mirrors actually do is reverse front and back, with the apparent left-right reversal being a feature of how we interpret the resulting image rather than a feature of what the mirror itself does to the light. To see this clearly, consider what happens when you face a mirror and raise your right hand. The image in the mirror raises what appears to be its left hand, or what would be its left hand if the image were a real person facing you. But the image is not a real person facing you. The image is a representation of yourself, with every point on your body mapped to the corresponding point on the image, with the only modification being that the points have been reflected through the plane of the mirror. The point on your right hand is mapped to a point that, from your perspective looking at the mirror, appears to be on the left side of the image. But this is because the mirror has reflected the image through its plane, putting the back of the image where the front of you is, and leaving the apparent left-right relationship as a consequence of how you are now interpreting the reflected image as if it were a person facing you. The mirror has not reversed left and right. The mirror has reversed front and back. The apparent left-right reversal is an artifact of how human perception interprets reflected images, not a feature of what mirrors do. This is a point that even many physicists initially get wrong, and it has been the subject of careful philosophical analysis by researchers including Martin Gardner, Richard Feynman, and others who have written about the puzzle. A simple test makes the point unmistakable. Hold a piece of writing up to a mirror. The text in the mirror is reversed in a specific way. The letters appear to read from right to left, rather than from left to right. But notice what is actually happening. If you wrote the text on transparent paper and looked at it from behind, you would see the same reversal. The mirror has not done anything to the text other than allow you to see it from behind. The text was unchanged. The viewing perspective changed. The same operation, applied to your body, produces the apparent left-right reversal. Your body has not been changed by the mirror. The mirror has produced an image that allows you to see your body from a perspective that ordinarily you could not occupy, the perspective of facing yourself. From this perspective, the side of your body that you would call your right corresponds spatially to the side of the image that, were the image a separate person facing you, would be that person's left. The reversal is in the interpretive framework, not in the geometric operation. The deep lesson of the front-back reversal is that what we ordinarily call mirror reflection is more conceptually subtle than common sense assumes. The mirror does something specific to the geometry of the light it reflects, and that specific operation is reflection through the plane of the mirror. The operation has consequences for how images appear, but the consequences are not what untrained intuition takes them to be. And this kind of subtlety, where careful physical analysis reveals that an apparently simple phenomenon has features that ordinary intuition gets wrong, is characteristic of the deeper investigations that physics has undertaken into the nature of symmetry itself. The same caution that applies to ordinary mirrors applies even more strongly to the cosmic mirrors that physics has studied. What we expect mirrors to do, on the basis of ordinary experience, is not what the mirrors of fundamental physics actually do. And the discrepancy between expectation and reality has had profound consequences for how we understand the cosmos. The investigation of symmetry as a fundamental concept in physics owes its modern shape to one of the most remarkable mathematical achievements of the 20th century, the work of Emmy Noether at the University of Göttingen. Noether, working in 1915 and publishing her results in 1918, established what is now called Noether's theorem. The theorem articulates a deep connection between continuous symmetries of physical systems and conservation laws. For every continuous symmetry of a physical system, there is a corresponding conserved quantity. If the laws of physics are unchanged when you translate in space, the conserved quantity is momentum. If the laws are unchanged when you translate in time, the conserved quantity is energy. If the laws are unchanged when you rotate in space, the conserved quantity is angular momentum. The theorem provides a precise mathematical bridge between two of the most important concepts in physics, and it has shaped almost everything that has been done in foundational physics since its publication. The implications of Noether's theorem for the study of mirrors and symmetry are direct. If a physical system is symmetric under reflection, under the operation that takes the system to its mirror image, then the symmetry must correspond to some conservation law. Conversely, if there is some asymmetry between a system and its mirror image, there must be a corresponding violation of some conservation law or some other consequence that breaks the simple correspondence. The mathematical framework that Noether provided made it possible to ask, with precision, whether and to what extent the laws of physics are symmetric under reflection. And the question, when asked carefully, turned out to have answers that would profoundly reshape the understanding of what the universe actually is. The basic symmetries that physicists studied in the decades following Noether's work fall into a few main categories. Spatial translation symmetry, the symmetry under shifting the coordinate origin, gives rise to the conservation of momentum. Spatial rotation symmetry, the symmetry under rotating the coordinate axis, gives rise to the conservation of angular momentum. Time translation symmetry, the symmetry under shifting the origin of time, gives rise to the conservation of energy. These three continuous symmetries account for three of the most important conservation laws of physics, and they are now understood as deep features of how nature operates rather than as accidental empirical regularities. In addition to these continuous symmetries, physicists also studied a set of discrete symmetries, symmetries that involve transforming a system in a single specific way rather than continuously varying parameters. The three most important of these discrete symmetries are parity, charge conjugation, and time reversal. Parity, denoted by the letter P, is the symmetry under reflection. The parity operation takes a physical system and replaces it with its mirror image, reversing all spatial coordinates. Charge conjugation, denoted by the letter C, is the symmetry under exchanging particles with their antiparticles. Every particle in physics has a corresponding antiparticle with the same mass and other properties, but with opposite charge and opposite values for certain other quantum numbers. The charge conjugation operation replaces every particle with its antiparticle, producing what is sometimes called the antimatter mirror image of the original system. Time reversal, denoted by the letter T, is the symmetry under reversing the direction of time. The time reversal operation takes a physical process and runs it backward, with all velocities reversed and all time-dependent quantities flipped. Each of these discrete symmetries deserves separate consideration because each captures a distinct way in which the universe might or might not exhibit perfect symmetry. Parity, the symmetry that we are particularly concerned with in this series, asks whether the laws of physics treat left-handed and right-handed configurations identically. A right-handed coordinate system, in which the x-axis, y-axis and z-axis follow the right-hand rule, can be mirrored into a left-handed coordinate system in which the same axes follow the left-hand rule. If the laws of physics are parity symmetric, then any physical process that occurs in a right-handed configuration must occur identically in the corresponding left-handed configuration. The two configurations would be physically indistinguishable. Nature, on the parity symmetric assumption, would have no preferred handedness. The universe would be ambidextrous in the deepest possible sense. Charge conjugation symmetry asks the parallel question for matter and antimatter. If the laws of physics are charge conjugation symmetric, then any physical process involving particles must occur identically in the corresponding process, with all particles replaced by their antiparticles. Hydrogen atoms, made of protons and electrons, would have antimatter counterparts made of antiprotons and positrons, and the antimatter atoms would behave identically to ordinary hydrogen atoms in all respects. The two kinds of matter would be related by a perfect symmetry. The universe, on the charge conjugation symmetric assumption, would not distinguish between matter and antimatter at the level of fundamental physics. Time reversal symmetry asks the parallel question for the direction of time. If the laws of physics are time reversal symmetric, then any physical process can be run backward without violating any of the basic equations. A movie of a process played forward and the same movie played backward would both depict physically possible processes. The universe, on the time reversal symmetric assumption, would have no preferred direction of time at the level of fundamental physics. The apparent directionality of time in our experience would, on this view, be a feature of how matter happens to be arranged rather than a feature of the underlying laws. For most of the first half of the 20th century, physicists assumed that the laws of physics were symmetric under each of these discrete operations individually. The laws should not change if you reflected the universe in a mirror. The laws should not change if you replaced every particle with its antiparticle. The laws should not change if you reversed the direction of time. The assumption was that nature did not have a preferred handedness, that it did not distinguish between matter and antimatter, that it did not have a preferred direction in time. The three discrete symmetries on this view were absolute features of the physical world. The empirical basis for these assumptions was, in the early decades of the 20th century, considerable. The known laws of mechanics, of electromagnetism, of gravity, all appeared to respect the discrete symmetries. The mathematical formulations of the major physical theories incorporated the symmetries automatically. There seemed to be no compelling reason to doubt that the laws would continue to respect these symmetries as physics extended its investigation into less familiar regimes. The strong nuclear force, when it was beginning to be characterized in the 1930s and 1940s, appeared to respect parity. The electromagnetic force respected parity. The gravitational force respected parity. The general assumption was that the weak nuclear force, the fourth and least understood of the fundamental forces, would also respect parity, and that the symmetry under reflection was a universal feature of nature. The combined symmetry under all three operations, denoted CPT, occupies a special place in modern physics. The CPT theorem, proved by Gerhard Luders, Wolfgang Pauli, and others in the early 1950s, establishes that any reasonable quantum field theory must be invariant under the simultaneous application of all three operations together. The CPT symmetry is, in this sense, almost mathematically required by the basic structure of relativistic quantum field theory. To violate CPT would require giving up some of the most fundamental assumptions of modern physics, including either Lorentz invariance or the standard structure of quantum field theory. As far as anyone has been able to test, CPT symmetry holds exactly. The combined symmetry of charge conjugation, parity, and time reversal is, on the available evidence, a precise feature of how the universe operates. But this combined symmetry is the only one that has held up under careful examination. The individual symmetries, when tested with sufficient precision, all turn out to be violated in specific ways. The story of how these violations were discovered is one of the most dramatic stories in the history of physics, and it bears directly on the question of why the universe exists at all. The first and most spectacular of the violations was the discovery that parity is not conserved in the weak nuclear force, the force that governs certain kinds of radioactive decay. The discovery, which we will examine in detail in the next inquiry, came in 1956, and it shocked the physics community in ways that few experimental results before or since have done. The assumption that nature did not have a preferred handedness, that it did not distinguish between left and right, was overthrown by an elegant experiment, and the implications of this overthrow, when their full consequences were worked out, turned out to be among the most profound results in modern cosmology. For the moment, what can be said with confidence is that the simple picture of mirrors that ordinary intuition provides, in which a mirror reflects an image of whatever is placed before it without changing anything fundamental about the underlying physics, conceals a far more interesting reality. The mirror in your bathroom does what we have described, reversing the front-back orientation of the image while leaving the underlying physics unchanged in any deep sense. But when you look more carefully at the mirrors that physics has tried to apply to the universe itself, the mirrors of parity, charge conjugation, and time reversal, these mirrors turn out to be imperfect in specific and consequential ways. The universe is not symmetric under the operations that the simple picture would lead us to expect, and the imperfection of the cosmic mirrors is, on the analysis that has been worked out across decades of experimental and theoretical investigation, precisely what allows the universe to exist as something rather than nothing. This represents a substantial departure from the picture that earlier physics had constructed. The universe was assumed to be a place of perfect symmetry, where the laws of physics did not distinguish between left and right, between matter and antimatter, between past and future. The universe has turned out to be something more interesting. It is a place where the symmetries are slightly imperfect, where the mirrors do not quite reflect properly, where the matter and antimatter are not produced in exactly equal amounts, and where these slight imperfections accumulate across the entire span of cosmic history into the structured and matter-filled cosmos that we actually observe. The cosmos is the residue of asymmetry. It is what survives when the cosmic mirrors have done their work, and the survival, the existence of structure rather than empty radiation, is the consequence of the slight breaking of the symmetries that earlier physics had assumed to be perfect. What this means for the deeper questions about what the universe is becomes clearer as the investigation proceeds. The mirror is not a passive feature of the cosmic structure. The mirror, in some sense the inquiries are still working to articulate, is at the center of why there is a cosmic structure at all. Without the mirror, and without its imperfection, there would be no universe to ask the question. The asymmetry that we will be examining in detail is therefore not just a curiosity about how subatomic particles behave in particular experiments. The asymmetry is, in a precise cosmological sense, the condition for our existence, and the question of how to understand this condition, how to relate it to the broader question of why anything exists at all, is the question that physics has been working on since the discoveries of the mid-20th century made the asymmetry undeniable. Long before any laboratory could test the symmetries of fundamental physics, contemplative thinkers in widely separated cultures had used the metaphor of the mirror to articulate their deepest insights about the nature of reality. The Christian apostle Paul, writing in the middle of the 1st century, used the mirror as the central metaphor for his account of the limits of human understanding. In the 13th chapter of his first letter to the church in Corinth, Paul wrote that we now see through a mirror in an enigma, but then face to face. The Latin Vulgate, the translation that shaped most of Western Christian theology, rendered the phrase as per speculum in enigmate, through a mirror in a riddle. The image captured Paul's recognition that human knowledge of the deepest realities is, in the present condition of existence, indirect, mediated, partial, like the indirect knowledge that comes from looking at a reflected image rather than at the object itself directly. The mirror was, for Paul, the figure of the limited and reflected character of all human knowing of what is most real. The Greek philosophical tradition had used similar imagery in its own different framework. Plato, in the 7th book of his Republic, articulated his famous allegory of the cave, in which prisoners chained from birth could see only the shadows that flickered on the wall before them, taking the shadows for the actual reality of which they were the dim reflections. The cave is not literally a mirror, but the structural insight is parallel. The world we ordinarily perceive is, on Plato's analysis, a derivative reflection of a deeper reality that we do not directly access. The shadows on the wall stand to the actual objects as reflections stand to the originals they reflect. To know the deeper reality is, on Plato's framework, to turn from the shadows to the source from which they derive, to ascend from the reflected image to the originating form. These metaphors, which we will examine in detail in our third inquiry, did not arrive at their insights through experimental investigation of the symmetries of the weak nuclear force. They arrived through sustained contemplative attention to the structure of human knowing, to the relationship between what we directly experience and what we take to be most fundamentally real. What they recognized, in their own different vocabularies, was that the relationship between the manifest world and the underlying reality has the structure of reflection. The world we know is, in some sense, each tradition articulated differently, the reflected image of a deeper reality whose direct apprehension is reserved for some further condition of knowledge that ordinary perception does not provide. The structural parallel between this contemplative recognition and the modern physical picture, in which the visible cosmos is the imperfect reflection of a deeper symmetric structure that did not survive into the present cosmic state, is striking. The vocabularies differ. The metaphysical frameworks differ. But the recognition that what we observe is a reflection of something more fundamental, and that the reflection has features that depart from what perfect symmetry would produce, is shared across multiple lines of inquiry that had no contact with each other. We will now turn to the more detailed physics of how the symmetries of the universe were discovered to be imperfect, and what the discovery implies for the deepest questions about why the cosmos exists. The fundamental discovery, that parity is not conserved in the weak nuclear force, came from one of the most carefully designed experiments in the history of physics. The result, when it was announced, overturned assumptions that had been taken for granted by the entire physics community. And the implications, as they have been worked out over the decades since, have established the asymmetry of the cosmic mirror as one of the most profound facts about the universe we inhabit. This is the story we will examine in detail in the next inquiry. The mirror, at the heart of physics, when looked at carefully, turns out to be something other than what ordinary intuition would have predicted. And the something other is, in a precise sense, the reason there is anything at all. Nature is not ambidextrous. This is the conclusion that physics arrived at in 1956 through one of the most elegant experiments in the history of science, and it is the foundation of everything we now understand about why the universe exists. The discovery, when it was announced, shocked the physics community in ways that few experimental results before or since have produced. The assumption that the laws of nature did not distinguish between left and right, that any process occurring in a right-handed configuration must occur identically in the corresponding left-handed configuration, that the universe was perfectly symmetric under reflection, was overthrown decisively. The universe, on the analysis the experiment confirmed, has a preferred handedness. Nature is, in a precise sense that has been worked out across decades of subsequent investigation, fundamentally and irreducibly left-handed at the deepest level of one of the four fundamental forces. The mirror image of a physical process is not, in general, identical to the original process. The cosmic mirror, when it was finally tested rigorously, turned out to be imperfect. And the imperfection, far from being a minor curiosity, is the structural feature that makes the cosmos what it is. The story of how this discovery came to be has its origins in a puzzle that emerged in the early 1950s in particle physics. The puzzle concerned two particles that physicists at the time called the theta meson and the tau meson. These two particles appeared to be identical in every way that physicists could measure. They had the same mass. They had the same lifetime. They had the same spin and the same charge. By every test that could be applied, they seemed to be the same particle, but they decayed in different ways. The theta meson decayed into 2 pions, the tau meson decayed into 3 pions, and the products of the two decays had different parities. If the theta and the tau were the same particle, then a single particle would have to be capable of decaying into final states with opposite parities. This was a problem, because conservation of parity, which had been assumed to be an absolute symmetry, would have forbidden such an outcome. Either the theta and the tau were two different particles that happened to share all measurable properties except their decay modes, which seemed implausible, or the assumption that parity was conserved was wrong, which seemed even more implausible. Two young theoretical physicists, Tsung-Dao Lee at Columbia University and Chen-Ning Yang at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, decided to examine the second possibility seriously. In a paper published in October 1956, Lee and Yang argued that, while parity conservation was well established for the strong nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, and gravity, it had never actually been tested in the weak nuclear force, the force responsible for the decays under question. The assumption that parity was conserved in the weak interactions was just that, an assumption, with no experimental basis to support it. Lee and Yang proposed several specific experimental tests that could resolve the question. If parity was conserved in the weak force, the experiments would produce one set of outcomes. If parity was violated, the experiments would produce a different set of outcomes. The question was experimentally decidable, and the experiments needed to be done. The decisive experiment was performed by Chien-Shiung Wu, a Chinese-American physicist at Columbia University whose work in experimental particle physics had already established her as one of the most precise and meticulous experimenters of her generation. Wu, working with collaborators from the National Bureau of Standards in Washington, designed an experiment to test parity conservation in the beta decay of cobalt 60. The experiment required cooling the cobalt 60 nuclei to extremely low temperatures, near absolute zero, so that they could be aligned by an applied magnetic field. The aligned nuclei would then undergo beta decay, emitting electrons in some direction relative to the applied magnetic field. If parity was conserved, the electrons would be emitted equally in both directions along the field, with no preference for one direction over the other. If parity was violated, the electrons would be emitted preferentially in one direction. The experiment was technically demanding, requiring sophisticated low-temperature techniques and careful control of magnetic field alignment. Wu spent months perfecting the apparatus and the procedure. The technical challenges of the experiment deserve emphasis because they illustrate the precision that Wu's work required. Cooling the cobalt 60 sample to within a fraction of a degree of absolute zero required adiabatic demagnetization techniques that were at the frontier of low-temperature physics. Maintaining the alignment of the nuclear spins long enough to observe the beta decay required precise control over the magnetic environment. Detecting the emitted electrons and determining their angular distribution required careful calibration of the detection apparatus. Each step had to be controlled to a precision that would allow the predicted asymmetry, if it existed, to be observed unambiguously. Wu and her collaborators worked through the winter of 1956, refining the experiment and ruling out potential sources of systematic error. The result was a measurement of unprecedented quality, capable of detecting parity violation if it existed, and capable of confirming parity conservation if it did not. The result, when it came in late 1956, was unambiguous. The electrons from the beta decay of cobalt, 60, were emitted preferentially in one direction relative to the applied magnetic field. Parity was not conserved. The mirror image of the experimental setup, with the magnetic field reversed, would have produced electrons emitted in the opposite direction, but the original setup itself produced an asymmetric distribution that no parity symmetric law could have predicted. Nature, in the weak nuclear force, distinguished between left and right. The assumption that had been taken for granted by the entire physics community was simply wrong. The shock among physicists was profound. Wolfgang Pauli, the great Austrian theorist, had famously written in a letter to a colleague that he could not believe nature would allow such a thing, that the parity-violating universe seemed to him an offensive idea that he was certain experiment would refute. When Wu's results came in, Pauli was forced to revise his certainty. The universe, on the empirical evidence, did exactly what Pauli had thought it would not do. A second confirmation of parity violation came almost simultaneously from a different experiment, performed at Columbia by Richard Garwin, Leon Lederman, and Marcel Weinrich. Their experiment studied the decay of muons, another type of subatomic particle that decays through the weak interaction, and showed that the decay also exhibited parity violation. The two independent confirmations, coming within weeks of each other, established the result beyond any reasonable doubt. The weak nuclear force, on the empirical evidence, did not respect parity. The universe was not symmetric under reflection. The cosmic mirror, in this fundamental respect, was broken. Li and Yang were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1957 for their theoretical work proposing that parity conservation should be tested in the weak interactions. The award came less than a year after Wu's experimental confirmation, an unusually rapid recognition by the standards of the Nobel Committee. But Wu herself, whose experimental work had actually demonstrated the parity violation, was not included in the prize. The omission has been the subject of considerable historical reflection. Wu's experimental contribution was acknowledged at the time and has been celebrated since, but the formal Nobel recognition went to the theorists rather than to the experimentalist who had actually performed the decisive test. Wu went on to a long and distinguished career, becoming the first female president of the American Physical Society and receiving numerous other honors, but she was never awarded the Nobel Prize. Whatever the historical reasons for this exclusion, the discovery itself stands as one of the great moments in 20th century physics, a moment when an assumption that had been taken as obvious was shown to be false by a careful experiment, and when the consequences of the falsity began the long process of being worked out. The implications of parity violation extended far beyond the immediate puzzle of the theta and tau mesons. The discovery showed that nature, at the level of fundamental physics, has a preferred handedness. The weak nuclear force, which governs many radioactive decays and which plays a role in the nuclear processes that power the sun, treats left-handed and right-handed configurations differently. The universe is, in this specific sense, asymmetric at its core. Other fundamental forces, including the strong nuclear force, electromagnetism, and gravity, do appear to respect parity to the precision of available measurements. But the weak force does not. And the weak force, despite its name, is one of the four fundamental forces of nature, integrated into every aspect of the standard model of particle physics. The asymmetry that the weak force introduces is therefore not confined to a peripheral corner of physics. It is part of the basic fabric of how matter and energy interact at the deepest levels. The discovery of parity violation prompted physicists to ask whether the other discrete symmetries might also be violated. Charge conjugation symmetry, the symmetry under exchanging particles with their antiparticles, had also been assumed to be exact. If the weak force violated parity, perhaps it violated charge conjugation as well. Initial investigations suggested that the violations of parity and charge conjugation in the weak force were related. The combined operation of charge conjugation followed by parity, denoted Cp, appeared to leave the laws of physics unchanged, even though the individual operations did not. The combined Cp symmetry seemed to be the actual symmetry that nature respected, with the apparent violations of P and C being two sides of a single deeper symmetric arrangement. For about a decade, this picture seemed to hold up. Nature, on this view, was not symmetric under reflection alone, and not symmetric under particle-antiparticle exchange alone, but was symmetric under the combined operation of doing both at once. This picture, however, did not survive careful experimental investigation. In 1964, James Cronin and Val Fitch, working at Brookhaven National Laboratory in Long Island, New York, performed an experiment to test Cp symmetry in the decay of neutral kaons. The neutral kaon system was particularly suitable for such tests because it involved long-lived particles whose decay properties could be measured with high precision. Cronin and Fitch found, to their surprise, that the decay rates of certain kaon states were not exactly what Cp symmetry would have required. The violation was small, on the order of 1 part in 1,000, but it was unmistakable. Cp symmetry, like P and C individually, was not exact. Nature, on the most careful experimental tests, did not respect even the combined symmetry of charge conjugation and parity. The cosmic mirrors, in all their individual and combined forms, were imperfect. Cronin and Fitch were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1980 for this discovery. The implications of Cp violation for cosmology were articulated in a remarkable theoretical paper by the Soviet physicist Andrei Sakharov in 1967. Sakharov, who was at the time one of the principal architects of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, but who would later become a famous human rights activist, asked what conditions would be required for the early universe to produce more matter than antimatter. His paper, titled Violation of Cp Invariance, C Asymmetry, and Baryon Asymmetry of the Universe, identified 3 necessary conditions. First, there must be processes that violate the conservation of baryon number, the quantity that distinguishes matter from antimatter. Second, there must be violations of both C symmetry and Cp symmetry. Third, the relevant processes must occur out of thermal equilibrium in conditions where the rates of forward and reverse reactions differ. If any of these 3 conditions fails, the early universe would have produced equal amounts of matter and antimatter, which would have annihilated, leaving behind only radiation. If all 3 conditions are met, a small surplus of matter over antimatter could survive the annihilation, and that surplus would be the source of all the matter we observe in the present universe. Each of Sakharov's 3 conditions deserves separate consideration, because each captures a distinct requirement that the universe must have satisfied. The first condition, the requirement of baryon number violation, says that there must be physical processes capable of converting non-baryons into baryons or the reverse, processes that change the net baryon content of the universe. Without such processes, any starting condition with equal matter and antimatter would remain symmetric, and no surplus of matter could ever develop. The second condition, the requirement of C and Cp violation, says that the matter-creating processes and the antimatter-creating processes must occur at different rates. If C and CP were exact symmetries, then any process that produced an extra baryon would be matched by an equally fast process that produced an extra antibaryon, and the two would cancel out. The asymmetry between matter and antimatter requires that the laws of physics treat the two sides differently in the relevant processes. The third condition, the requirement of departure from thermal equilibrium, says that the relevant processes must occur fast enough that the forward direction dominates over the reverse direction. In thermal equilibrium, every process and its reverse occur at the same rate, and any asymmetry that one process generates is immediately erased by the reverse process. Out of equilibrium, the asymmetry can persist and accumulate, leading to the surplus of matter that survives. The first two of Sakharov's conditions are now known to hold. CP violation has been observed experimentally, both in the kaon system that Cronin and Fitch studied, and in other systems such as the B meson system that subsequent experiments have characterized. Symmetry is also known to be violated. The third condition, the requirement of out-of-equilibrium processes, is satisfied in the conditions of the very early universe, when the cosmos was expanding and cooling rapidly. Whether the specific processes that actually produced the baryon asymmetry have been correctly identified is still a matter of active research. The standard model of particle physics, despite its many successes, does not produce enough CP violation to fully account for the observed asymmetry between matter and antimatter. Some additional source of CP violation, beyond what the standard model contains, appears to be required. Various proposals have been investigated, including supersymmetric extensions of the standard model, additional sources of CP violation in the neutrino sector, and other possibilities. The question of exactly which physics produced the baryon asymmetry remains one of the major open questions in modern cosmology. A particularly active line of investigation involves the possibility that the asymmetry was generated through processes involving neutrinos. Neutrinos are extremely light particles that interact only through the weak force and gravity, making them particularly difficult to study experimentally. The discovery in the late 1990s and early 2000s, by experiments at the Super Kamiokande detector in Japan and the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory in Canada, that neutrinos have non-zero mass and can oscillate between different types, open new possibilities for understanding the role of neutrinos in cosmology. If neutrinos are their own antiparticles, a possibility known as Majorana neutrinos that has not yet been definitively confirmed, then certain processes involving heavy neutrinos in the very early universe could have generated the matter asymmetry through a mechanism known as leptogenesis. The asymmetry would have been produced first in the lepton sector, the sector containing electrons and neutrinos, and then transferred to the baryon sector through processes that violate both lepton number and baryon number while conserving their difference. Leptogenesis is a serious theoretical possibility, with active experimental programs searching for the predicted signatures, but it has not yet been definitively confirmed. What can be said with confidence is that the asymmetry exists, that it is the consequence of broken cosmic mirrors at the level of fundamental physics, and that it is the structural condition for our existence. Without the parity violation that Wu discovered, without the CP violation that Cronin and Fitch confirmed, without the additional sources of asymmetry that the universe must have employed, the matter and antimatter of the early universe would have annihilated completely. The cosmos would be a vast, empty space filled only with radiation. There would be no atoms, no chemistry, no biology, no consciousness. The fact that there is structured matter at all, the fact that you exist as a configuration of this matter capable of asking questions about the cosmos that contains you, is the consequence of a slight imperfection in the symmetries that earlier physics assumed to be exact. The cosmic mirror is broken. The breaking is what makes us possible. Beyond the established physics of CP violation in the standard model, More speculative theoretical work has explored the possibility that the broken mirrors of fundamental physics might be linked to even deeper structures. One line of speculation involves what physicists have called mirror matter, hypothetical particles that would constitute a parallel sector of the universe in which the broken parity of our familiar matter would be reversed. The idea was developed in detailed form by Rabindra Mohapatra at the University of Maryland and others beginning in the 1980s, and it has been pursued by various theoretical groups since. On this view, every particle in our familiar matter has a mirror counterpart with the opposite-handedness, and the mirror sector might constitute a substantial fraction of the dark matter that astronomers observe through its gravitational effects. The mirror matter hypothesis is genuinely speculative, with no experimental confirmation as of this writing. It represents one of several possible explanations for the dark matter problem, and it remains contested within the broader theoretical physics community. What it illustrates, however, is the extent to which the discovery of broken symmetries has prompted physicists to consider whether the universe might have hidden structures that the broken symmetries point toward. The slight asymmetry in our matter sector might be the visible signature of a deeper symmetry that involves additional sectors not directly observable in our experiments. The mirror matter hypothesis, even in its most cautious form, is worth pausing over because of what it implies about the structure of fundamental physics. If the asymmetry between matter and antimatter and the asymmetry of the weak force itself are signatures of a deeper symmetry that has been broken, then the broken symmetry might leave traces that we have not yet detected. The mirror sector, if it exists, would interact with our familiar matter only through gravity, since the other forces would not directly couple between the two sectors. The gravitational effects of mirror matter could, on some specific scenarios, account for some or all of the dark matter that astronomers have inferred from the rotation of galaxies, the motion of galaxy clusters, and the patterns of cosmic microwave background fluctuations. None of this is established. All of it is conjecture. But the conjecture is interesting because it suggests that the broken cosmic mirror might be hiding a symmetric counterpart that we have not directly accessed, and that the search for evidence of this counterpart could become a productive line of investigation in the coming decades. A different but related line of investigation has emerged from the work on the holographic principle that we considered in our earlier inquiries. The holographic principle, articulated by Gerard Hooft at Utrecht University in 1993 and Leonard Susskind at Stanford University in 1995, holds that the information content of any region of space is fully captured by a description living on the boundary of that region. The bulk geometry, on this view, is a holographic projection from the boundary information. The relationship between the bulk and the boundary has the structure of a kind of mirror, with the deeper reality of the boundary being reflected into the manifest reality of the bulk. The holographic mirror is, in this respect, similar in structure to the mirrors that the parity and CP discussions have illuminated. The manifest reality is a derivative reflection of a deeper structure. The deeper structure has features that the manifest reality does not directly exhibit, and the relationship between the deeper structure and its manifest reflection is one of the most important relationships in the contemporary physics of fundamental reality. The most rigorous theoretical confirmation of the holographic principle came from Juan Maldacina's 1997 work on the ADS, CFT correspondence, in which a particular theory of gravity in a five-dimensional anti-de Sitter spacetime was shown to be mathematically equivalent to a particular four-dimensional quantum field theory living on the boundary of that space. The two descriptions are completely equivalent, but they have radically different geometric structures. In one description, there is a five-dimensional bulk with gravity and matter located at various positions. In the other description, There is a four-dimensional boundary with quantum fields and no gravity at all. Both descriptions are correct. Both describe the same physics. But the relationship between them has the structure of a holographic mirror, with each feature on one side corresponding to some feature on the other side. The mirror, in this case, is not a simple reflection of one configuration into another. The mirror is a sophisticated mathematical correspondence in which features in different numbers of dimensions and with different geometric properties stand to each other as different aspects of a single deeper reality. The connection between the broken parity and CP symmetries on the one hand and the holographic structure of spacetime on the other has been the subject of considerable theoretical reflection. Both pictures point in the same direction. The reality we observe is not the deepest layer. The deepest layer is something more symmetric, more structured, more fundamental than what we directly access. The reality we observe is the broken or projected version of this deeper layer, exhibiting features that make our existence possible while obscuring the deeper symmetries from which it derives. The cosmos that we inhabit is, in this picture, the imperfect reflection of a deeper symmetric reality, with the imperfection being the very condition for our being able to inhabit it. A perfectly symmetric universe would be a universe of no surviving matter. The imperfection is the gift of asymmetry that allowed structure to emerge. This recognition can be deepened by considering the relationship between the bulk and boundary in the holographic framework more carefully. The boundary in the standard formulations contains a quantum field theory that describes all the physics of the bulk. The bulk is the holographic projection from this quantum field theory. The two descriptions are mathematically equivalent, but they assign different roles to different features of physics. Symmetries that are global in the boundary description correspond to gauge symmetries in the bulk. Operators in the boundary correspond to fields in the bulk. The mapping between the two is precise, and it has been worked out in considerable detail in specific theoretical contexts. What this implies for the question of mirrors is that the relationship between the boundary and the bulk is itself a kind of mirror, with each feature on one side corresponding to some feature on the other side. The cosmos is, on the holographic picture, a vast network of such mirror correspondences, with the deeper reality being projected into the manifest reality through structures that resemble in their geometric form the kind of reflections that ordinary mirrors produce. This is, of course, speculative when extended too far. The holographic principle is a serious theoretical framework, well established in specific contexts such as anti-de Sitter spacetime, but its full applicability to the actual physical cosmos remains a matter of active research. The connection to the broken parity and CP symmetries is also speculative, with the precise relationship between these different aspects of fundamental physics still being worked out. What is not speculative is the basic recognition that the manifest cosmos exhibits broken symmetries, that the broken symmetries are the condition for our existence, and that the deeper structures of fundamental physics have features that ordinary intuition about mirrors does not anticipate. The mirror at the heart of the cosmos is more sophisticated than the mirror in your bathroom. The cosmic mirror reflects in ways that produce real consequences for what survives and what is annihilated, for what can come into existence and what cannot, for what kind of universe is possible at all. These developments, taken together, articulate a picture of the cosmos as a derivative structure that emerges from a deeper symmetric reality through a series of broken or imperfect reflections. The deeper reality is more symmetric than what we observe. The processes that produced our cosmos involve breaking some of these symmetries while preserving others. The matter that constitutes us is the residue of these breakings, the surviving fragment of what was originally a more symmetric configuration, and the universe we inhabit is, on this picture, not the foundation of being, but the manifest projection of a deeper layer, with the projection having features that reflect both what was preserved and what was broken in the cosmic processes that produced it. What this means for the deeper questions about why the universe exists, and what kind of relationship we stand in to the fundamental reality from which we derive, is a question that has clear connections to insights that contemplative traditions have been articulating for thousands of years. The Christian Apostle Paul's recognition that we now see through a mirror in an enigma anticipated in religious vocabulary, the modern recognition that the manifest reality is a reflected and partial expression of a deeper underlying truth. Plato's allegory of the cave anticipated, in philosophical vocabulary, the modern recognition that what we observe is a derivative shadow of a deeper structured reality. These contemplative recognitions did not arrive at their insights through experimental tests of weak interactions or theoretical analyses of holographic principles. They arrived through sustained attention to the structure of human knowing and the relationship between manifest experience and the deeper reality that experience points toward. What they recognized, in their own different vocabularies, was the same structural feature that modern physics has now confirmed through entirely different methods. The reality we observe is reflection, projection, or derivative manifestation of a deeper layer that is not directly accessible. The deeper layer has features that the manifest layer obscures, and the relationship between the manifest layer and the deeper layer is one of the most fundamental features of how reality is constituted at all. The most extensive contemplative articulation of this insight, particularly in the form most directly relevant to the question of mirrors, comes from the Sufi tradition of Islamic mysticism. The 13th century Andalusian Sufi master Ibn Arabi, whose work we have considered in earlier inquiries, articulated a vision of the relationship between the divine and the world, in which the world is the mirror in which the divine sees itself manifested. A famous hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, treated as authoritative in the Sufi tradition, captures the essential insight in compressed form. The hadith records the divine voice as saying, "I was a hidden treasure, and I loved to be known, so I created." The creation, on this Sufi reading, is the mirror through which the divine reality comes to know itself. The world is the reflection in which the hidden becomes visible. The structural parallel between this contemplative recognition and the modern physical recognition that the manifest cosmos is the projection or reflection of a deeper structure is striking. The vocabularies differ, the metaphysical commitments differ, but what is being recognized, in both cases, is the relationship between a deeper reality and its derivative manifestation, with the manifestation being the condition for the deeper reality to be revealed at all. We will turn to these contemplative recognitions in detail in our next inquiry. The physics is now in place. The asymmetries that allowed the universe to exist have been characterized. The deeper structures from which the manifest cosmos derives have been articulated as far as current theoretical work has been able to reach. What remains is to examine, with the care that the convergence deserves, what the contemplative traditions actually said about mirrors and reflection, what their saying meant in its own original context, and what its convergence with the modern physical picture implies for the broader question that this entire investigation has been pursuing. The cosmic mirror is broken. The breaking is the condition for our existence. And the question of how to understand this fact, how to relate it to the deepest questions about what we are and why anything exists at all, is the question that the rest of the inquiry will pursue. Long before any laboratory could test parity and beta decay, before any mathematical framework existed for thinking about CP violation or the holographic structure of space-time, contemplative thinkers in widely separated cultures arrived at structurally similar pictures of how the manifest world relates to the deeper reality from which it derives. the methods used were not measurement and theory. The methods used were sustained attention to the structure of human knowing, to the relationship between what we directly experience and what we take to be most fundamentally real, and to the contemplative practices that those traditions developed for engaging with what they understood to be the source of all manifest existence. What these thinkers found, in their own different vocabularies, was that the world we ordinarily perceive has the structure of reflection. The visible cosmos is, in some sense each tradition articulated differently, the mirror in which a deeper reality manifests itself, and the relationship between the manifest mirror and the deeper source it reflects is one of the central recognitions that the contemplative traditions have organized themselves to investigate. The convergence between these contemplative recognitions and the modern physical recognition that the cosmos is the imperfect projection of a deeper symmetric reality is, when both bodies of inquiry are taken seriously, one of the most striking convergences in the history of human thought. The most theologically developed articulation of the mirror metaphor in the Western religious traditions appears in Christianity, where the image has been one of the central figures for thinking about the relationship between human knowing and divine reality across 2,000 years of theological reflection. The foundational text is in the New Testament, in the 13th chapter of the Apostle Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, written in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era. Paul, in a passage that has become one of the most often quoted in Christian literature, addressed the limits of human knowing in language that placed the mirror at the very center of the theological framework. We now see, Paul wrote in the Greek of the original text, through a mirror in a riddle, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. The Latin Vulgate, the translation that shaped most of Western Christian theology across the medieval period, rendered the phrase as vidimus nunc per speculum in enigmate tunc autem facia ad faciem. The image captured Paul's recognition that human knowledge of the deepest realities is, in the present condition of existence, indirect, mediated, partial, like the indirect knowledge that comes from looking at a reflected image, rather than at the object itself directly. The mirror was, for Paul, the figure of the limited and reflected character of all human knowing of what is most real. The implications of Paul's articulation were drawn out across centuries of subsequent theological reflection. The image of seeing through a mirror in a riddle became a fundamental theological vocabulary for thinking about the difference between present knowing and ultimate knowing, between the indirect access we have to divine reality in our current existence and the direct access that the tradition expected in some final eschatological condition. The mirror, in this framework, is not a deficiency to be overcome by intellectual effort. The mirror is the structural condition of human knowing in the present, the way that finite created beings can have any access at all to a divine reality that exceeds their direct comprehension. The reflection allows the relationship to occur. The relationship is real. But the reflection remains a reflection, with the directness of face-to-face knowing reserved for the further condition that the tradition anticipated. A complementary articulation appears in the New Testament epistle of James, where the mirror is used in a different but related way. The first chapter of James contains a passage that compares hearing the word without acting on it to a person who looks at his face in a mirror and immediately forgets what he looked like. The image captures the recognition that the mirror's revelation is a particular kind of knowing, one that requires sustained attention and integration with action to be effective. The mirror shows you something true about yourself, but the truth has to be received, retained, and acted upon for the showing to have its proper effect. The mirror, on this Jamesian use, is an image for the kind of self-knowledge that the religious life requires, and for the failure that occurs when self-knowledge is glimpsed, but not integrated into the life that emerges from the glimpse. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, developed the mirror metaphor in a more sophisticated theological framework in his great work De Trinitate, the treatise on the Trinity that occupied him for nearly 2 decades. Augustine sought, in this work, to understand how the structure of the divine Trinity could be reflected in the structure of the human soul, with the soul being the mirror in which the divine reality leaves its traces in the created world. The doctrine of the imago Dei, the image of God, articulated in the first chapter of Genesis, where humans are described as created in the divine image, became for Augustine the foundation of an extensive theological exploration of how the human soul reflects the structure of the divine. The soul, Augustine argued, has a triune structure that mirrors the triune structure of the Godhead. The faculties of memory, understanding, and will, distinguishable but inseparable in the unity of the single soul, mirror the distinguishable but inseparable persons of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in the unity of the single divine reality. The soul is, in this framework, the mirror in which the deepest structure of the divine becomes visible in created form, and the contemplative life is the attention to this mirror that allows the soul to recognize what it actually is. The medieval scholastic tradition developed these insights with great philosophical precision. Bonaventure, the 13th century Franciscan theologian who was Thomas Aquinas' contemporary and his rival in the universities of Paris, articulated in his Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, written in 1259, a comprehensive vision of the entire created cosmos as a mirror of the divine. The work, whose title is usually translated as The Mind's Journey into God, traces an ascent from the contemplation of created things in the natural world to the direct apprehension of the divine that transcends them. At each stage of the ascent, the created world functions as a mirror in which divine reality is reflected with greater or lesser clarity. Bonaventure distinguished 3 modes of mirroring. The created world reflects the divine as a vestige, a trace or footprint that points back toward the original. The human soul reflects the divine as an image, a more direct and structured reflection that bears the imprint of the divine more fully. The graced soul, the soul that has been opened to divine action through religious life and contemplative practice, reflects the divine as a likeness, a clearer mirror in which the divine reality becomes visible with the highest clarity available to created existence. The threefold structure of vestige, image, and likeness articulated, in Bonaventure's framework, the entire range of how creation mirrors the Creator, and the contemplative ascent that the work described was the journey through these increasing degrees of mirror clarity toward the direct vision that lay beyond all mirrors. A particularly striking articulation of these themes appears in the work of Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century German abbess and visionary, whose theological writings combined scriptural reflection with extensive accounts of the visions she received throughout her life. Hildegard's major theological work, the Civias, completed around 1151, included visions in which the divine appeared as a mirror in which the entire structure of cosmic and salvific history was reflected. The visions used the imagery of light and reflection extensively, with particular features of the cosmos and of human life appearing as specific aspects of how the divine light is mirrored in the created world. Hildegard's work has been the subject of considerable scholarly attention in recent decades, particularly for its integration of theological insight with what might now be called proto-scientific observation of the natural world. What is striking, for our purposes, is the consistency with which the mirror image appears throughout her writing as the central figure for the relationship between the divine and the created. The Christian tradition continued to develop the mirror metaphor across the medieval and early modern periods. The first epistle of John, in its 3rd chapter, anticipates an eschatological condition in which we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. The transformation that the verse anticipates is, on the standard theological reading, the moment when the mirror is removed and the direct vision begins. The whole structure of the Christian theology of seeing rests on this distinction between the mirror condition of present knowing and the face-to-face condition of ultimate knowing, with the mirror being the structural feature of finite existence that allows the relationship to occur, but that remains incomplete until the final transformation. The Greek philosophical tradition contributed its own articulation of mirror imagery, with implications that extended well into the broader development of Western thought. Plato, writing in 4th century Athens, used the imagery of reflection most famously in his allegory of the cave, presented in the 7th book of his Republic. The allegory describes prisoners chained from birth in a cave, facing a wall on which they see only the shadows that flicker, cast by objects passing before a fire behind them that they cannot see. The prisoners take the shadows for the actual reality of the world, having no other access to anything else. If one prisoner is freed and turned around to see the fire and the objects, then taken outside the cave to see the sun and the world it illuminates, the prisoner gradually comes to understand that what had seemed to be reality was only the reflected and indirect appearance of a deeper actuality. The structure of the allegory is precisely the structure of mirror reflection. The shadows on the wall stand to the actual objects as reflections stand to the originals they reflect. The world we ordinarily perceive is, on Plato's analysis, a derivative reflection of a deeper reality that we do not directly access until contemplative ascent leads us out of the cave toward the source. The implications of Plato's allegory for the broader question of mirrors and reality were drawn out in considerable detail by Plato himself in his other dialogues, and by his successors in the Platonic tradition. The Timaeus, Plato's dialogue on cosmology, presented the entire created cosmos as a kind of moving image of eternity, a temporal reflection of an eternal pattern that exists in the realm of forms. The world, on this Platonic vision, is the mirror in which the eternal forms become visible to mortal observers, with the visibility being mediated by the temporal and material conditions of created existence. The forms themselves are not directly visible. They become visible through their reflection in the manifest world, with the reflection being the condition for any contact between mortal knowing and the eternal reality that the forms constitute. Plotinus, the 3rd century philosopher whose Enneads articulated the most systematic Platonic philosophy of late antiquity, developed these themes into a comprehensive metaphysics of mirroring. The deepest reality in Plotinus's framework is the One, the simple unity from which all multiplicity derives. From the One, Plotinus argued, emanates the intellect, in which the One is reflected and known. From the intellect in turn emanates the soul, in which the intellect is further reflected and articulated. From the soul emerges the manifest world of bodies and material existence, in which the soul is reflected with diminished clarity. The structure of reality, on Plotinus's vision, is a cascading series of reflections, with each lower level mirroring the higher level from which it derives. The cosmos is, in this framework, an enormous chain of mirrors, with the deepest reality of the One being reflected at increasing degrees of remove through the ordered hierarchy of being. The contemplative life on this Platonic Plotinian framework is the ascent back through these mirrors, returning from the manifest reflection to the source from which all reflection derives. The structure of Plotinus's emanation has features that bear directly on the question of how mirroring operates as a metaphysical principle. Each level of emanation is the reflection of the level above it, but the reflection is not perfect. Each level loses something of the unity and simplicity of the source, gaining in turn the multiplicity and articulation that allow the manifest world to come into being. The One itself remains entirely simple, unmanifest in its purity, but the intellect that emanates from it is the One reflected in the medium of intellectual activity, with the multiplicity of the forms being the way the one can be known in the mode of knowing rather than in the mode of pure being. The soul, in turn, is the intellect, reflected in the medium of life and motion, with the temporal articulation of psychic existence being the way intellectual unity can be expressed in the mode of becoming rather than in the mode of static being. The manifest world is the soul reflected in the medium of matter, with material extension being the way that psychic reality can be expressed in the mode of bodily existence. At each level, the reflection introduces something that was not present in the source, even as it reflects the essential structure that the source possesses. The cascading mirrors are therefore not merely passive reproductions but creative articulations, each revealing something that the higher level contained only implicitly. The implications of this Platinian framework for the contemplative life are direct. The journey of the soul, in Plotinus's vision, is the journey back through the mirrors, ascending from the manifest world through the soul and the intellect toward the one that is the source of all reflection. Each step of the ascent involves recognizing the current level as a reflection rather than as the ultimate reality, and turning toward the source from which the reflection derives. The contemplative practice that the tradition developed for facilitating this ascent involved sustained attention to the One as the goal of all knowing, the recognition that the manifest world and even the higher levels of intellectual and psychic reality are derivative reflections of a unity that lies beyond all of them. The ascent culminates, on Plotinus's account, in the direct union with the one that lies beyond all mirroring, the moment when the journey through reflections gives way to the direct contact with the source that all reflections have been pointing toward. The myth of Narcissus, told in Greek and Roman literature most fully in the Metamorphoses of Ovid, articulates a different but related insight about mirrors. Narcissus, in the myth, sees his own reflection in a pool of water and falls in love with the reflected image, not realizing that the image is his own. He pines away beside the pool, unable to leave the reflection that has captivated him, and eventually dies and is transformed into the flower that bears his name. The myth has been read in many ways across its long reception, and the modern term narcissism derives from psychoanalytic readings that emphasize the pathological self-love at the heart of the story. But the original mythic insight is more subtle. The danger Narcissus faced was not simply self-love. The danger was the mistaken identification of the reflected image with the deeper reality that the reflection points toward. The reflection was real. The pool genuinely showed Narcissus his own face, but Narcissus' mistake was to take the reflection as the totality of what was being shown, rather than as the indirect figure of a deeper reality that the reflection could never fully capture. The trap of the mirror, on this reading, is the trap of mistaking the reflected image for the source from which the reflection derives. The contemplative tradition's emphasis on moving beyond mirrors, on seeking the direct vision that lies beyond the reflection, can be understood as a sustained warning against the Narcissus trap, a warning that has been echoed in various forms across the contemplative literature of multiple traditions. The Sufi tradition of Islamic mysticism, which we have considered in earlier inquiries, has placed the mirror metaphor at the center of its philosophical and contemplative reflections in ways that have no precise equivalent in any other tradition. The most extensive articulation comes from Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Andalusian Sufi master whose enormous output we have considered before, and whose work has shaped Islamic mystical thought across the 8 centuries since his death. Ibn Arabi's central insight, articulated in countless passages across his vast corpus and developed with particular clarity in his Fusus al-Hikam, is that the manifest world is the mirror in which the divine reality comes to know itself. The world is not an independent creation that exists alongside the divine. The world is the reflection in which the hidden becomes visible, the mirror in which the divine sees its own self-disclosure manifested in created form. the hadith of the hidden treasure, attributed to the Prophet Muhammad in the Sufi tradition, captures the foundational insight in compressed form. The divine voice declares, in this hadith, that I was a hidden treasure, and I loved to be known, so I created creation that I might be known. The hadith has been the subject of extensive Sufi commentary across the centuries. Its central claim is that creation is, at its deepest level, the divine self-disclosure, the mirror in which the hidden becomes manifest. Without creation, the hidden treasure remains hidden, unknown even to itself in the specific mode of being known that creation makes possible. With creation, the divine reality has the mirror in which it can recognize itself, and the recognition is the core of what creation actually accomplishes. The implications of this Ibn Arabian framework for understanding the human person are direct and profound. The human being, in the framework, is the most cleanly polished mirror in which the divine reality can become manifest. The doctrine of the Insan al-Kamil, the perfect human, captures this recognition. The perfect human is not a particular individual who has achieved special status. The perfect human is the structural function that the human person can fulfill, the role of being the mirror through which the divine reality knows itself most completely in created form. The heart, in particular, is the seat of this mirroring function. The Sufi practice of polishing the heart, of clearing it of the obscurations that prevent the divine from seeing itself in its created mirror, is the central contemplative discipline of the tradition. The polished heart becomes the perfect mirror, and the divine self-recognition that occurs in this mirror is the highest achievement of human existence. Rumi, the 13th century Persian Sufi poet whose Mesnavi has been one of the most widely read poetic works in the Islamic world, articulated the same insight in poetic form across thousands of verses. The mirror metaphor recurs throughout his poetry. The lover sees the beloved in the mirror of the lover's own being. The world is the mirror in which the divine countenance is reflected. The polishing of the heart is the work of becoming a clearer mirror. The structural insight is the same as Ibn Arabi's, but the form is different. Where Ibn Arabi articulated the framework in dense theological prose, Rumi articulated it in verse that has shaped the spiritual imagination of Persian-speaking and Turkish-speaking cultures for centuries. The Hindu tradition arrived at structurally parallel recognitions through its own different framework, with the mirror image occupying a particular role in the philosophical reflections of the Vedantic tradition. The doctrine of Darpananyaya, the mirror analogy, became one of the standard analytical tools for Advaita Vedanta in articulating the relationship between the absolute and the manifest world. The basic intuition is that the manifest reality is to the absolute as a reflection in a mirror is to the original being reflected. The reflection has the appearance of being a separate thing. The reflection has the apparent properties of the reflected, but the reflection has no independent existence apart from the original from which it derives. The world, on the Vedantic application of the mirror analogy, has the same kind of derivative existence relative to Brahman, the absolute reality. The world appears to be a separate reality. The world has apparent properties that distinguish it from the absolute. But the world has no independent existence apart from Brahman, and the recognition of this dependence is one of the deepest insights of the Advaita Vedantic tradition. The doctrine of Pratibimbavada, the reflection theory, develops the mirror analogy in more technical detail. The individual self, the jivatman that each person experiences as their particular identity, is on this analysis the reflection of the universal Atman in the medium of individual mind and body. The individual self is real at its level. The individual self has the apparent properties that distinguish it from other individual selves, but the individual self has its existence only as the reflection of the universal Atman in the specific medium of a particular person's psychological constitution. The recognition of this relationship in the Vedantic tradition is one of the keys to liberation. The compulsive identification with the local reflected self, as if it were the totality of what one is overcome through the recognition that the deepest reality of one's being is the universal source from which the local reflection derives. The 8th century philosopher Shankara, who systematized Advaita Vedanta in his commentaries on the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras, drew out the implications of these mirror analogies with particular precision. The world, on Shankara's analysis, is neither real nor unreal in the unqualified sense. The world is a kind of intermediate reality, the reflection of Brahman in the medium of Maya, the cosmic illusion that produces the appearance of multiplicity and separation. The reflection is real as reflection. The reflection points toward and depends on the source. The reflection is not separate from the source in any deep ontological sense, but the reflection is also not identical with the source, and the difference between them is what makes the manifest world, rather than the absolute itself. To recognize the relationship correctly, on Shankara's framework, is to enter into a more accurate understanding of what one's own existence actually is. The Buddhist tradition of East Asia developed the mirror metaphor in a particularly compressed and influential form in the Zen tradition that emerged in China and spread to Japan. The most famous articulation appears in a story about the 6th patriarch of Chinese Zen, Huineng, whose biography is recorded in the Platform Sutra, one of the foundational texts of Chinese Buddhism. The story tells of a poetry contest organized by the 5th patriarch, in which the most accomplished disciples were invited to compose verses that would demonstrate their understanding of the Buddhist path. The senior disciple Shengshu composed a verse that compared the body to the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha attained enlightenment, and the heart to a mirror stand on which a clear mirror was placed. The discipline of practice, on Shengshu's analysis, was the constant polishing of the mirror to keep it free from dust. The verse expressed the conventional understanding of contemplative practice as the gradual refinement of the heart mirror through sustained discipline. Huineng, who at the time was an illiterate kitchen worker at the monastery, composed a counter-verse that has become one of the most famous in the entire Zen tradition. There is, Huineng wrote, no Bodhi tree, nor stand of any mirror. There is fundamentally not one thing. Where can dust alight? The verse rejects the imagery of the mirror that needs polishing. The mirror that Shengshu's verse described is, on Huineng's deeper insight, itself a construction of the discriminating mind. To take the mirror as something real that needs maintenance is to remain at a level of practice that has not yet recognized the deepest truth. The deepest truth, on the Zen tradition that Huineng's verse came to represent, is the original emptiness from which both the mirror and the dust derive, and recognition of this emptiness is the goal that all practice points toward. The Huineng verse has been the subject of countless commentaries across the subsequent centuries of Zen tradition. Its rejection of mirror imagery is not, on the careful readings, a denial that mirrors are useful figures. Its rejection is a warning against taking the mirror as a final reality rather than as a teaching device. The mirror is a figure for a particular stage of contemplative development. The deepest realization moves beyond the figure to the recognition that even the imagery of polishing and dust is itself part of the constructed framework that the deepest realization releases. The mirror, in this Zen framework, is something to be used and then transcended, a teaching aid that points beyond itself to a recognition that no metaphor can fully capture. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has incorporated mirror imagery into its own different framework. The metaphor of mirror-like wisdom, sometimes called Dadarsha Jnana in the Sanskrit terminology that the Tibetan tradition inherited, refers to one of the 5 wisdoms that characterize awakened mind. Mirror-like wisdom is the capacity to reflect what arises clearly and without distortion, neither adding to nor subtracting from what is presented to awareness. The metaphor has been developed in considerable detail in the Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions, where the cultivation of mirror-like clarity is one of the central concerns of contemplative practice. The Jewish tradition has placed the mirror metaphor at the center of its religious anthropology through the doctrine of Tselem Elohim, the image of God, articulated in the first chapter of Genesis. The Hebrew phrase B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, describes the human person as having been created in such a way that the human reflects the divine in created form. The doctrine has been the subject of extensive interpretation across the entire span of Jewish religious thought, and its implications for ethics, anthropology, and theology have been worked out in countless directions. What is fundamental to all of these interpretations is the recognition that the human person stands in a specific relationship to the divine reality, a relationship that the metaphor of the image or mirror captures with particular clarity. The human is not an arbitrary creature in the world. The human is the mirror in which the divine becomes visible in created form, the specific creation through which the divine reality has chosen to be reflected most fully in the manifest world. The Kabbalistic tradition that developed within medieval Judaism extended the mirror imagery into a comprehensive cosmology. The doctrine of the Sephirot, the 10 emanations through which the infinite divine reality manifests itself in the manifest world, has the structure of a cascading series of reflections. The infinite, called Ein Sof in the Kabbalistic terminology, is itself unmanifest and beyond all mirroring. The Sephirot are the successive emanations through which the infinite manifests itself in increasingly differentiated form, with each Sephirah being the mirror in which the previous level of emanation is reflected and articulated. The structure of being, on the Kabbalistic vision, is therefore an enormous chain of mirrors, with the manifest world at the bottom of the chain being the cumulative reflection of all the higher levels through which the infinite has manifested itself. The doctrine of Adam Kadmon, the primordial human, articulates the same vision in anthropomorphic form, with a cosmic human being, the comprehensive mirror in which the entire structure of divine emanation is reflected and contained. What emerges across these various traditions, despite their profound differences in cultural context, theological commitment, and practical orientation, is a structural recognition that has clear parallels to what modern physics has now articulated in its own technical vocabulary. The manifest world is a reflection of a deeper reality. The relationship between the manifest reflection and the deeper source is one of the central features of how reality is structured. The contemplative life, in each of these traditions, is in some sense the work of attending to this relationship, of understanding the manifest world correctly as the reflection of something deeper, and of moving in the direction of the source rather than remaining captivated by the reflection. The contemplative traditions did not arrive at these recognitions through experimental tests of weak interactions or through theoretical analyses of holographic correspondences. They arrived through sustained attention to the structure of human knowing and the relationship between manifest experience and the deeper reality that experience points toward. And what they recognized, in their own different vocabularies, is structurally parallel to what modern physics has now confirmed about how the cosmos is constituted. The convergence is not equivalence. The Christian doctrine of the Imago Dei is not, the Sufi Insan al-Kamil is not the Vedantic Darpana, Nyaya is not the Zen, original face is not the Jewish Tselem, Elohim. Each tradition is doing its own work, with its own commitments, in its own context. The vocabularies differ, the metaphysical frameworks differ profoundly. What they share, despite these differences, is the recognition that the manifest world has the structure of reflection that the relationship between the manifest reflection and the deeper source is one of the central facts about reality, and that the contemplative life is, in some way, the attention to this relationship. And modern physics, working from entirely different premises and using entirely different methods, has arrived at a structurally parallel recognition through its own roots. The universe we inhabit is the imperfect reflection of a deeper symmetric reality. The imperfection is the structural condition for our existence. And the question of how to understand this fact, how to relate it to the deepest questions about what we are and why anything exists at all, is the question that the final inquiry will pursue. You are the residue of broken symmetry. The body that reads these words, the brain that processes them, the consciousness that integrates the processing into the experience of being you, is composed of matter that survived the cosmic annihilation that occurred in the first moments after the Big Bang. For every particle of matter that constitutes you, there should have been a corresponding antiparticle that would have annihilated it, leaving only radiation. The fact that the antiparticle did not arrive, the fact that 1,000,000,001 quarks survived for every billion antiquarks that were produced, the fact that the small surplus of matter has accumulated across billions of years into the structured cosmos that contains you, is the consequence of a slight imperfection in the symmetry that earlier physics assumed to be exact. Without this imperfection, you would not exist. The cosmos would be empty radiation. The Big Bang would have produced and immediately undone all its own products. The fact that there is something rather than nothing, the fact that there is you reading these words, rather than empty space filled with photons, is what the broken cosmic mirror has accomplished. This is the situation we now have to face, not as an abstraction but as the most personal fact about being alive. Your existence is the gift of asymmetry. The mirror at the heart of physics is broken, and the breaking is what makes you possible. Before drawing out what this means, intellectual honesty requires examining the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built is not the only available reading of the evidence, and several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders. Any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating. The first and most important objection concerns the speculative status of some of the more dramatic theoretical extensions of the broken symmetry framework. The mirror-matter hypothesis, which we considered earlier, is genuinely speculative, with no experimental confirmation as of this writing. The connection between the broken parity symmetry of our familiar matter and the structure of any hidden mirror sector remains a matter of theoretical exploration rather than established physics. The relationship between the holographic principle and the broken symmetries of the standard model is similarly a matter of theoretical investigation rather than empirical confirmation. The well-established physics of the broken symmetries themselves, the parity violation that Wu measured, the CP violation that Cronin and Fitch confirmed, the Sakharov conditions that articulate the requirements for matter asymmetry, are all on solid empirical footing. But the broader picture, in which these established results point toward a deeper symmetric reality whose structure we have not yet directly accessed, involves theoretical commitments that go beyond what the experimental evidence requires. This objection deserves to be taken seriously. The honest acknowledgement is that the structural picture we have been developing, in which the manifest cosmos is the imperfect reflection of a deeper symmetric reality, involves theoretical extensions of the established physics that have not been definitively confirmed. The picture is well motivated by the established results. The picture has structural parallels to insights from contemplative traditions that have nothing to do with the modern theoretical work. But the strongest forms of the picture, in which the deeper symmetric reality has specific identifiable features that current experiments could in principle detect, remain hypotheses awaiting further investigation. The honest position is to take the picture seriously as a serious possibility while acknowledging that its strongest forms are not yet established. The second objection concerns the contemplative traditions themselves and the contested status of some of the recognitions we have considered within their own theological and philosophical frameworks. The Sufi doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud, articulated most influentially by Ibn Arabi and developed by his successors, has been controversial within Islamic theology since its first formulation. The claim that there is, at the deepest level, only one reality, and that the manifest world is the mirror in which this single reality manifests itself, has been read by some Islamic thinkers as compromising the fundamental distinction between the divine creator and the created order. Mainstream Sunni Islamic theology has often been cautious about the strongest formulations of Wahdat al-Wujud, preferring frameworks that preserve a sharper distinction between the divine and the created. The Ibn Arabian framework remains influential within Sufi traditions and within certain strands of Islamic philosophy, but it is not the universal Islamic position, and presenting it as such would distort the actual diversity of Islamic theological thought. Similar internal debates exist within other traditions. The Advaita Vedantic doctrine that the individual self is the reflection of universal Atman in the medium of individual mind has been contested by other Hindu philosophical schools, including Visistadvaita and Dvaita, which preserve sharper distinctions between the individual soul and the divine. The Christian doctrine of the Imago Dei has been interpreted in many different ways across the long history of Christian theology, with substantial differences between Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant readings, and with substantial differences within each major branch about exactly what the doctrine implies. The Buddhist Huineng Shengxiu story, while emblematic for the Zen tradition, articulates a position that has been challenged in various ways within the broader Buddhist tradition, with different schools holding different views about the relationship between the polishing, the mirror practice, and the recognition of emptiness practice. The convergences we have been examining are real, but they are convergences across diverse and internally contested traditions, and any responsible account has to acknowledge the internal diversity within each tradition, rather than presenting any single articulation as the definitive view. A third objection focuses on the popular abuse of mirror imagery in contemporary spiritual literature. The recognition that mirrors have a special status in contemplative traditions has been seized upon by various popularizers to develop practices that the underlying traditions did not endorse. The most common version is the claim that staring into a mirror with positive affirmations can produce specific real-world outcomes, drawing on the broader manifestation industry's framework. This kind of practice, which has been promoted in numerous self-help books and online programs, is a misreading of what the contemplative traditions actually taught about mirrors. The Sufi practice of polishing the heart was not a technique for producing material outcomes through positive thinking. The Christian recognition that we see through a mirror in a riddle was not an instruction to use mirrors for self-affirmation. The Vedantic doctrine of Darpana Nyaya was not a practice technique for personal development. These contemplative recognitions were sustained engagements with the structure of human knowing and the relationship between the manifest world and the divine reality. Their reduction to self-help techniques distorts both the science and the traditions, and the response to this distortion has to be a clear distinction between what the contemplative traditions actually taught and what popular distortions claim they taught. A fourth objection focuses on the Narcissus trap that we considered in the contemplative section. The myth of Narcissus warns against the mistaken identification of the reflected image with the deeper reality that the reflection points toward. But there is a related danger that affects discussions of mirrors in spiritual contexts. The recognition that the manifest world is a reflection of the divine can be used as a way of avoiding engagement with the manifest world itself. The reflection can be dismissed as illusion, with the spiritual life being framed as the escape from the reflection toward the supposed reality that lies beyond it. This kind of escapism is, on every careful reading of the contemplative traditions themselves, a serious distortion of what they actually teach. The traditions hold the recognition of reflection together with the affirmation of the manifest world. The reflection is real. The manifest world is real. The contemplative practice is the recognition of how the manifest reflects the divine, not the rejection of the manifest in favor of some other reality. The Vedantic recognition that the world is the reflection of Brahman does not entail that the body should be neglected. The Sufi recognition that the world is the mirror of the divine does not entail that the duties of ordinary life should be abandoned. The Christian recognition of the Imago Dei does not entail that human relationships and responsibilities are unimportant. The traditions hold reflection and reality together, and the relationship between them is treated as the central practical question of how to live in light of the recognition. A fifth objection comes from the anthropic principle, the argument that the broken symmetries are the condition for our existence, while empirically accurate, has a circular feature that careful philosophy of physics has long recognized. We can only observe the universe we exist in. If the universe were perfectly symmetric and produced no surviving matter, there would be no observers to notice the absence of matter. The fact that we observe a universe in which the symmetries are broken in just the way required to produce surviving matter is therefore not direct evidence that the breaking is, in some deeper sense, oriented toward producing observers. The breaking is correlated with our existence by definition, since we could not exist without it. Whether the breaking has any deeper significance beyond this anthropic correlation is a further question that the bare observation of the breaking does not settle. The honest acknowledgement is that the observation of broken symmetries that allowed our existence is consistent with several different metaphysical interpretations. The breaking might be deeply meaningful, the result of some process that selected for observer-permitting universes. The breaking might be merely contingent, one of many possible configurations the universe might have had, with our particular observation being conditioned on the configuration that produced us. Or the breaking might point towards some still deeper structural feature of reality that current physics has not fully articulated. The choice between these interpretations is not settled by the observed asymmetry alone. A sixth objection concerns the convergence claim that has structured our entire investigation. The structural parallels between modern physics and contemplative traditions are real, as we have argued in detail. But the temptation to overstate these parallels, to use the structural similarities as a way of giving the contemplative claims more empirical authority than they actually have, or to use the contemplative reflections as a way of giving the scientific claims more meaning than they support, is a real intellectual danger. The contemplative traditions did not anticipate parity violation in beta decay. The traditions did not predict the specific mathematical structure of the ads, CFT correspondence. The traditions worked within their own theological and philosophical frameworks, with their own methods and their own purposes, and their insights stand on their own terms within those frameworks. The modern physics, similarly, did not arise from contemplative reflection but from sustained empirical investigation guided by mathematical theory. The two bodies of inquiry stand on their own terms, and the structural parallels between them, however real, do not collapse the distinctions between what each kind of inquiry has actually accomplished. The convergence is real at the level of structural recognition. The convergence is not equivalence at the level of detailed claims. To respect the convergence is to acknowledge it without treating it as a unified theory in which the science validates the traditions or the traditions enrich the science. The integrity of each kind of inquiry has to be preserved, and the parallels between them should be observed without being forced into a tighter relationship than they actually warrant. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty, but a structural picture that holds up under examination. The cosmic symmetries are broken in specific ways that the experimental physics has confirmed. The breakings are correlated with our existence in ways that the cosmological calculations have specified. The contemplative traditions have articulated, in their own different vocabularies, structurally parallel pictures of the manifest world as the reflection of a deeper reality. The convergences are real, even as the specific frameworks of science and tradition remain distinct, and the implications for how a person can understand their existence as a configuration of matter that survived a cosmic annihilation follow from the recognition rather than from any specific metaphysical commitment. The picture has connections to many other strands of inquiry that have been pursued in this larger investigation. The recognition that the geometry of black holes might be understood as a kind of mirror, with the event horizon serving as the surface beyond which information is reflected back into the cosmos in transformed form, is closely related to the broader picture of cosmic mirroring that we have been developing. Whatever the specific physics of black hole information turns out to be, the structural picture in which the cosmos contains regions that function as mirrors for the information that crosses their boundaries is consistent with the recognition that mirroring is one of the basic structural features of how reality is organized at large scales. The recognition that the act of observation, the relationship between an observer and the observed system, has features that ordinary intuition does not capture, takes on additional resonance in the context of the broken cosmic mirror. The observer is, on the broader picture we have been developing, a particular configuration of the surviving matter that the cosmic asymmetry produced. The act of observing, in turn, is not a neutral inspection of an independent reality, but a relationship within the same broken symmetric universe that the observer is part of. The relationship between observer and observed has the structure of mirroring in the broader sense, with the observer functioning as a particular mirror in which the observed system becomes manifest in the specific mode of being known. The cosmos, in producing observers as one of its asymmetric byproducts, has produced mirrors in which it can recognize itself. And the relationship between these recognizing mirrors and the cosmos that produced them is one of the central features of how reality is organized at the level we are able to observe. The recognition that empty space is not empty, that the apparent void between the structures of matter is an active substrate of fields and quantum fluctuations, is closely related to the picture of broken symmetries that we have been developing. The vacuum, on the modern picture, is not the ground of perfect symmetric nothingness. The vacuum is itself a state of broken symmetries, with the specific configuration of broken symmetries that constitutes the present cosmic vacuum being one of the conditions that allow the matter we observe to have the properties it has. The Higgs mechanism, by which fundamental particles acquire mass, is itself a kind of symmetry breaking, with the masses of particles being the consequence of how the Higgs field has settled into its asymmetric vacuum state. The cosmos is, in this respect, the systematic exploration of how broken symmetries produce structure. The vacuum is broken. The matter content is broken. The forces are broken in their relationships to each other. The cumulative breakings are the structural features that allow the cosmos to have the elaborate order that we observe. The recognition that information has weight, that the universe is informational at its deepest level, has its own connection to the picture of mirrors. Information, in the holographic frameworks we have considered, is encoded on boundaries and projected into bulk regions through structures that have the form of mirroring. The information of the cosmos is, in some sense the inquiries are still working to articulate, mirrored across multiple levels of structure, with each level being the projection of information that exists more fundamentally elsewhere. The broken cosmic mirror is, in this respect, the projection of a deeper informational structure into the manifest reality that we observe. The information that constitutes you, the specific pattern of distinctions that makes you the configuration you are, is itself a particular projection of the deeper informational substrate that the broken cosmic mirror has produced. The recognition that the universe is non-local at the level of fundamental physics, that the connections between distant systems are stronger than any classical picture allows, finds its proper context in the broader picture of mirroring that we have been developing. The non-locality, on the deeper analyses, may be related to the holographic structure that connects bulk geometry to boundary information. The boundary, on this picture, is itself a kind of mirror in which the bulk is reflected, with the non-local connections between distant bulk regions being mediated by the structure of the boundary that contains the holographic information for the entire bulk. The non-locality of the cosmos and the mirror structure of cosmic reality are aspects of a single underlying recognition that the manifest world is the projection of a deeper layer in which the relationships between distant phenomena are more direct than the manifest geometry suggests. The recognition that what looks empty is actually full, that the apparent emptiness of regions between structures of matter is a substrate of intense activity, applies to the manifest cosmos as a whole when the broader mirror picture is taken seriously. The cosmos is not just a collection of objects in empty space. The cosmos is the active mirror in which the deeper symmetric reality manifests itself, with the mirror itself being structured in ways that produce the appearance of objects in space, rather than being a passive backdrop against which the objects exist. The mirror is not empty. The mirror is the active substrate of all manifestation, and the relationship between the mirror and what appears in it is one of the most fundamental relationships of how reality is organized. The recognition that there might be vast structures in the cosmos that resemble in their organization the structures of biological neural networks, with patterns of connection and activity that suggest something like cosmic scale information processing, takes on additional meaning when the cosmos is understood as a vast mirror system. The neural structures, if the broader recognition holds, would be themselves part of the mirroring activity through which the cosmos engages with its own deeper structure. The patterns of cosmic scale information processing would be the activity of the cosmic mirror as it processes the information of the manifest world that it contains. What this means for the religious and theological dimensions of human experience deserves attention proportional to its weight. The Christian doctrine of the Imago Dei articulates a vision in which the human person is created to be the mirror in which the divine becomes manifest in created form. When this framework is read alongside the modern cosmological recognition that the existence of structured matter, including the matter that constitutes the human body and brain, is the consequence of broken cosmic mirrors, the theological claim takes on a precision that its original articulation could not have anticipated. The human person who is the Imago Dei is, in chemical and physical fact, the configuration of surviving matter that the cosmic asymmetry produced. The divine that the human reflects is, in the contemplative tradition's articulations, the deeper source from which all manifestation derives. The relationship between the reflecting human and the divine source is the relationship between the broken cosmic mirror and the deeper symmetric reality that the mirror manifests imperfectly. You are not just an arbitrary configuration of matter. You are, in the convergent witness of the modern physics and the ancient theological tradition, a particular mirror in which the deeper reality of the cosmos becomes recognizable in the specific mode of finite created knowing. The Sufi recognition that the human being is, in potential, the polished mirror through which the divine recognizes itself, articulates a parallel insight in different vocabulary. The doctrine of the Insan al-Kamil, the perfect human, captures the recognition that the human person can serve, in its deepest aspect, as the mirror through which the hidden treasure becomes visible. The work of polishing the heart, of clearing the obscurations that prevent the divine from recognizing itself in its created reflection, is the central contemplative discipline of the tradition. When this framework is read alongside the modern recognition that the cosmos is the imperfect reflection of a deeper symmetric reality, the Sufi practice takes on additional weight. The human heart, in the Sufi vision, is the most cleanly polished mirror that the cosmos has produced. The polishing brings the manifest reflection into closer alignment with the deeper source. The work of contemplative polishing is, on this convergent reading, the participation of the human person in the broader cosmic process by which the broken mirror reaches toward the deeper symmetric reality from which it derives. The Vedantic recognition that the individual self is the reflection of the universal Atman provides a complementary framework for the same structural insight. What you are, at the deepest level, is the local reflection of the universal reality that constitutes the deepest layer of being. The surface ego, the particular psychological configuration that you take yourself to be, is real at its level. The deeper reality of what you are is the universal source whose reflection you carry. To recognize this, in the Vedantic tradition, is the deepest insight available to a human being, and the recognition does not require denying the surface ego or the manifest world. The recognition allows you to inhabit both the surface and the depth simultaneously, with the surface being understood as the reflection of the depth rather than as a competing reality. The Buddhist Huineng Shengxiu story articulates the same insight in a different mode. Both verses, in the Zen tradition, are correct at their respective levels. Shengxiu's verse, with its image of polishing the mirror, captures the actual practice of contemplative discipline as it operates in the lives of practitioners. Huineng's verse, with its rejection of the mirror imagery, captures the deepest realization that the imagery itself is part of the constructed framework that liberation releases. The two verses together articulate a comprehensive vision in which the mirror is both a useful figure for ordinary practice and a figure that has to be transcended for the deepest realization. The lesson, when both verses are read together, is that the human relationship to the mirror is itself something to be worked through, with the working through being part of what the contemplative life accomplishes. These traditions, taken together, converge on a practical orientation that bears on what to do with the recognition that has been the subject of this inquiry. The orientation involves a different relationship to the mirror images that fill our daily lives, the literal mirrors we look into, and the metaphorical mirrors of human relationships and cultural reflections through which we see ourselves and our world. The traditions have all developed practices that involve mirrors in various ways, and the practices have served, across thousands of years, as ways of bringing the recognition of mirroring into the lived experience of religious practitioners. There are particular practices that the contemplative traditions have developed for this kind of attention, and they are simpler than they might appear. The first is to attend to the experience of looking into an ordinary mirror. Most of us look at mirrors without attention, checking our appearance briefly in the morning and moving on. The practice is to bring brief attention to what is actually happening when you look into a mirror. You are seeing yourself from a perspective that ordinarily you cannot occupy, the perspective of facing yourself. The image you see is, in a precise physical sense, the reflection of you, with all the front-back inversion that we considered earlier. The image is not who you actually are. The image is a particular kind of representation of you, mediated by the specific physics of how light reflects off mirror surfaces. To attend to this, even briefly, is to encounter directly the structural feature of mirroring that the contemplative traditions have placed at the center of their reflections. The image is real. The image is a reflection. The deeper reality of who you are is not the image but the configuration of being from which the image derives. A second practice is to attend to the mirror function of other people. The faces and reactions and reflections of those around you are, in a precise psychological and social sense, mirrors in which you see something of yourself. The recognition you receive from other people, the responses they offer to your presence, the qualities they attribute to you, are part of how you come to know yourself in the social world. These mirrors are imperfect, like all mirrors. The reflections are partial and shaped by the perspectives of the reflectors. But the reflections are also real, and they are part of how you become recognizable to yourself across the long process of human life. To attend to this, occasionally, is to recognize that your sense of self is not a private possession that you bring into the social world fully formed. Your sense of self is, in significant measure, the cumulative effect of all the social mirrors in which you have been reflected across your life. A third practice draws on the contemplative tradition's insight that the manifest world itself is a mirror of deeper reality. To attend to the world as a mirror is to look at what is around you with the recognition that the patterns and structures you observe are reflections of something that lies beneath them. The trees and stones and buildings and weather patterns that fill your environment are not just objects in space. They are the manifestations of an underlying reality that has produced the specific configuration of matter and energy that constitutes the world you observe. To look at the world with the awareness that it is a mirror is to look with attention to the deeper structure that the mirror reflects. The practice does not require any special technique. It requires only the willingness, occasionally, to attend to the manifest world as a reflection rather than as a final reality. A fourth practice involves the question that the contemplative traditions have placed at the center of their concern with mirrors. Of whom are you the mirror? The Christian doctrine of the Imago Dei, the Sufi Insan al-Kamil, the Vedantic Darpananyaya, all suggest in their different vocabularies that the human person is the mirror in which something deeper becomes manifest. The practice is to ask, occasionally, what your specific existence is reflecting. The traditions have given various answers to this question, with the answers varying across the different theological frameworks. The practice of asking the question regardless of the specific answer one gives places the human person in a particular relationship to the broader cosmos, the relationship of being a specific mirror through which something is being reflected. A fifth practice, drawing specifically on the convergence between the modern science and the contemplative traditions, involves looking at other people with the recognition that they too are configurations of surviving matter from the same broken cosmic mirror that produced you. Every person you encounter is, in chemical and physical fact, the residue of the same cosmic asymmetry. Every person carries the same structural signature of broken symmetries that allowed them to exist at all. Every person is, in the contemplative tradition's articulations, a particular mirror in the cosmic system of mirroring through which the deeper reality becomes manifest in created form. To attend to other people with this recognition, even occasionally, is to enter into a different relationship with them than the ordinary social interactions allow. The other person is not just an instrumental presence in your life. The other person is a fellow configuration of cosmic asymmetry, a fellow mirror in the broader system, a fellow participant in the cosmic process by which the deeper reality recognizes itself through the manifest world. The attention does not require any special technique. It requires only the willingness, occasionally, to register that the persons around you share with you the same fundamental status as configurations of matter that survived the cosmic annihilation and that constitute, together, the network of mirrors through which the cosmos engages with its own structure. These practices are simple, but they accumulate. Practiced over time, they shift the relationship between the attending self and the manifest world. The world becomes less a collection of independent objects and more a structured mirroring of a deeper reality. The attention to mirrors becomes less an occasional practice and more a continuous awareness that the manifest world has the structure of reflection at every level. The shift is not dramatic in any single instance. The shift is the gradual deepening of relationship with the structural feature of reality that the contemplative traditions have placed at the center of their inquiries, and that modern physics has now confirmed in different vocabulary. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward, not a doctrine, not a system, not a framework that has to be believed, a recognition that the cosmos is structured by mirroring, that you are a particular configuration of the surviving matter that the broken cosmic mirror has produced, and that the question of how to inhabit this complex reality, this specific position as a mirror within a broader system of cosmic mirroring, is the question that the rest of your days will be the time you have to answer. The body that reads these words is the residue of broken symmetry. The matter that constitutes you survived a cosmic annihilation that should have left only radiation. The fact that you exist at all, the fact that there is consciousness in the universe asking questions about the universe, is the consequence of a slight imperfection in the symmetries that earlier physics assumed to be exact. You are not arbitrary. You are not accidental in the trivial sense. You are the specific configuration that the cosmic asymmetry made possible, the particular mirror in which the deeper reality of the cosmos has, for the brief duration of your existence, become recognizable to itself in the specific mode of being you. This recognition, when it is allowed to settle, has implications that go beyond intellectual understanding. The fear that ordinary perception carries about being a small being in a vast indifferent cosmos rests on the assumption that you are a separate object in a foreign universe. The recognition that the inquiries have been pointing at is that this assumption is, while accurate at one level, not the deepest fact about you. You are, at a deeper level, a mirror in the cosmic system of mirroring. The system of mirroring is what the cosmos is, and your specific position as a particular mirror is your contribution to the cosmic process of recognition that the system is engaged in. When you look into a mirror tonight, consider for a moment what is happening. The light from your face is striking the polished surface and reflecting back to your eyes. Your eyes are processing the reflected image and constructing the perception of yourself that you see in the mirror. The mirror is doing what mirrors physically do, with all the front-back inversion that we considered. And you, the configuration of matter, looking at the reflected configuration of matter, are participating in a specific instance of the broader cosmic mirroring. That is what the universe consists of. The mirror in your bathroom is, in a precise sense, a small element in the vast system of cosmic mirroring, through which the deeper reality of the universe manifests itself in the particular form of you, looking at yourself in a particular moment of your existence. The next time you look into a mirror, you will be participating in something that has been going on continuously throughout the history of the universe. The configurations of matter that constitute you are part of the same system of broken symmetries that produced all the structure in the cosmos. The act of seeing yourself reflected is one of the small but actual instances of the broader mirroring through which the cosmos engages with its own structure. The recognition of what mirrors are, what mirrors have been, what mirrors will continue to be, is available in the simplest of practices, the daily acts of looking at reflections of yourself and of the world around you. You are made of the residue of broken cosmic symmetry. The residue is structured by mirroring at every level. The convergence between the modern physics and the contemplative traditions on the recognition of mirroring is not a coincidence. The convergence is a feature of how reality actually works, recognized by both lines of inquiry through their entirely different methods. And what remains, when the convergence is taken seriously, is the question of how to live in light of what has been recognized. The question is not academic. The question is the most personal question available to a being whose existence is, at the deepest physical level, the consequence of the cosmic asymmetry that produced surviving matter. And the answer, when the recognition has had time to settle, is not anxiety about what you are made of, but a kind of grateful astonishment at the cosmic process, whose specific imperfections have been holding you in being all along, present in every moment of conscious experience, as the medium through which existence itself becomes possible for beings like yourself.